Hey guys, so this is season 1, episode 1 of Back to the Past. So this episode is a re-recording of the original episode because the original episode it was just wasn't up to our standards here at Back to the Past. So the topics are: what if the Versailles Treaty was harsher, and what if France went communist? Right. So first we're going to talk about France and what if they imposed a harsher Versailles Treaty on the Central Powers. So, for a little reference, real quick, the Great War was a war that changed basically all of Europe. As you know, almost everyone knows it. There was two sides: the Allies and the Central Powers. Eventually, the Allies won after long years of trench warfare, and the Allies lost. Both sides lost many men. As a result of this, the French wanted reparations and just enormous treaties. One might say that the Versailles Treaty was actually harsh on it itself, and it was. But there was actually plans to make it even harsher. So now with the background gone, let's get started.
So in this scenario, I think in order to accomplish that, I don't think it needs to be a more clean victory, like, for example, an invasion of Germany and conquering of Berlin. I think it just has to be a simple change of presidency. And in 1912, when Theodore Roosevelt actually went up for election against William H. Taft, who was running under the Republican ticket, and Woodrow Wilson running under the Democratic ticket, if he was simply nominated as the Republican nominee, I am almost confident that he would have won. And him being a war hawk during this time period, he would most certainly push for war, maybe as soon as 1915 when the Lusitania sunk. Furthermore, with that, he was also a big proponent of punishing the Central Powers, specifically Germany. And so in this scenario, I think that with the Republican nomination, Teddy Roosevelt would win the election in 1912. And in that case, with Teddy Roosevelt winning the election in 1912, I think America also gets involved earlier in World War I, which would then make it a more clean-cut victory, say in 1917. And now this could have repercussions on Russia, for example, but I don't think that's very possible just because of the fact that Russia was already in a pretty crummy state in 1917. But depending on when the United States would join the war and their troops would arrive, I think honestly we could even see maybe early 1918 when the war ends, because Germany was kind of all stretched out and everything, and I think we honestly very much underestimate the German army's power. So in this scenario, with Teddy Roosevelt pushing for a more harsher Treaty of Versailles, I think we see the split of Germany, which was actually proposed a part of the Treaty of Versailles. So what about you guys?
So you brought up that, like, a way for Germany to get a harsher treaty, or the harsher treaty of the Versailles, is that Theodore Roosevelt wins the election and becomes president. And that is exactly true, because you did say that he wanted the Central Powers to die. He wanted Germany to be weaker. And this is very true with his ideology, with his, like, he wanted America to expand and all of that. So for the Treaty of Versailles, there is this very popular version of the treaty, of like a French treaty, where they'll split up Germany into multiple states. So I think that's one way to make the treaty harsher for this alternate reality, because this proposition was already proposed, but obviously it didn't happen due to, in our reality, with Woodrow Wilson, and Woodrow Wilson kind of using his American ideology to make Germany into the state it was right now in our reality. But I think in this alternate history, the Treaty of Versailles will just split up Germany.
Yeah, I mean, there's been numerous reports that France was, because you got to take into account that France lost a good majority of their young men. So this is going to impact their population for years to come. And you can look at this actually during the Second World War. Unlike Germany, which became a larger population and they had more able men, France was actually lackluster in that population department. They actually had a lower amount of manpower than the Germans did. I mean, and also because of these trench warfares and stuff. So France suffered heavily during this time, and like this war was just disastrous for them. So it was so bad that they wanted Germany. They can never become a major power again. And when I say never, I mean never. Not in the next 20 years. I'm talking about, 50 years, 60 years, anywhere down the road. So not only would they be splitting up Germany, I could literally see French occupation in multiple parts of Germany as well, pushing in towards the Rhine. Hell, even owning parts of the Rhine. Sure, there'll be resistance, but France is determined because they don't want another German power.
Well, you also have to. You also forgot to mention this, and I think this is very important. You also forgot to mention the embarrassment of the Franco-Prussian War during 1870 to 1871. And the reason why that's so important is because specifically the French got retrieved at the end of the war. Alsace-Lorraine, which has been a very debated territory during this time period, and it's not really right now because Germany gave up on all those imperial ambitions a long time ago. But to further expand on your point, it's very interesting to see what happened with France's population, specifically during the Industrial Revolution. And the reason why the population was so low is not compared to Germany is not only because of the fact that the First World War kind of did a major blow to it, but also you have to look at the fact that France was one of the slowest growing industrial powers in the entire world. I believe it grew around. I'm not sure about this. I believe 8%. Meanwhile, Germany grew around 60% actually during that time period. So it only makes sense for why. And it's not even ignoring the immigration, because France was actually not really heavily emigrated out of, such as like Germany, for example. Yet they still grew 60%. So I think besides the fact that the Franco-Prussian War and all that, you're 100% right on that. I could definitely see an occupation of the Rhineland, and I mean like a actual occupation of it, because I think it'd be more of the natural borders of France they would expand to about, which is around the Rhine River or so. So I think you're kind of on the ballpark, and that also cripples Germany a lot because that's around, I believe, 25% of all industrial power in Germany, if I'm not wrong. It's a very good amount of raw material and also industrial power.
So the French economy was less powerful than, like, you could say its neighbors, right? Is that what you're saying? Because they didn't maybe invest in much into industrialization like the United States did, or even the United Kingdom. I mean, the United Kingdom, everyone knows that during the 19th century, they massively industrialized. Sure, it might have been a bit earlier than the United States, like during the Victorian era, but still, at the end of the day, all these nations are industrialized. And I mean, industrialization is just what's going to make the economy stronger.
Well, no, it wasn't that France didn't invest in industrialization as much. It's just that France just had a really low population growth rate, which is really weird for an industrial society. Because usually during the Industrial Revolution, for example, it was a major population boom for a lot of countries. Like I mentioned before, Germany had like a 60%. The UK grew by a lot too. I forgot what the exact numbers were. I believe France is around 8%, Germany is 60s, like I said before. And if you want to look at France's economy, for example, like you're not wrong. It's definitely kind of one of the weakest of the main, like the main powers in the world. You consider, Britain, Germany, France, Russia. It's the third weakest out of the four, according to around the year 1890. If you look at it, and it's definitely true in 1914. It's not that France didn't invest in industrialization. It's just that they didn't put as much into it as, say, Germany or Britain did. And they didn't have as much of a population boom as Germany and Britain did, or even America. And also, I want to correct you because the United States did majorly industrialize during the Victorian era, and the UK actually started earlier than the Victorian era, because the Victorian era is around the ascension of Queen Victoria in 1837 to her death in 1901. I can guarantee you the United States is a very different country between 1837 and 1901, disregarding the whole social issues regarding surrounding slavery and industrially in general.
All right, that was a good conversation about industrialization. But now I want to talk about the future impacts of this new Treaty of Versailles. I'm going to start with France, and I think this is pretty easy. I think France, like what Rohan was saying, may even like get some more territories and may get some German land, even though there's resistance, and that'll just boost the confidence of the French moral. They honestly, I think they'll just get German colonies. I think they'll just take it all. I mean, and they'll just make it one of their best colonies for France. And another thing about France is that with Germany being so weak, France now has like the biggest like control and influence over Europe besides UK. And I mean, it's obvious because the Treaty of Versailles, this new Treaty of Versailles benefits the French even more. But obviously, the UK is not going to like that because they're also Europeans and they have one of the biggest navy and all of that. And obviously, like, I don't think the UK is going to hate France, but like with this new Treaty of Versailles, with Germany broken off, and obviously like Austria-Hungary is going to be broken off, and I still think the Spanish Civil War is going to happen. France is going to be the biggest powerhouse in Europe, and I don't think UK can stand a chance. I mean, even though UK can be more industrialized and more advanced than the French, and you guys already talk about that, I still think the French will have more influence. So, Rohan, you want to go over about Germany's impacts in future?
So quickly before I go to Germany, I don't think the French and British would really have like harsh relations per se. I think they're going to remain good friends throughout the 20th century because they're realizing that they have to stick together now to new and upcoming threats. And they see that with the Central Powers. Sure, there's no Central Powers, but it's only a matter of time before some other country rises up out of the dust, you know? So actually, after the Versailles Treaty in our timeline, around 1980 to 1919, there was actually a revolution, an attempted communist revolution. In fact, the German government had to actually send in the military to crush this communist rebellion. So now with Germany all this fractured and stuff, I could actually potentially see this rebellion being somewhat successful, or at least having more success than it did on timeline. Like, honestly, I don't think even if it succeeded, I don't think it'll be allowed to live. I doubt that France would allow a communist nation to be anywhere near them. I mean, they were already starting to get scared of Russia, or now the Soviet Union, after the Russian Revolution. And I doubt that they're going to allow a communist nation near their hometown. But I mean, that just shows that the instability in the region. I mean, without this even a harsher treaty, there was already a rebellion. So with this harsher treaty, who knows what we could see? We could see maybe more communist revolutions, more authoritarian revolutions, maybe even a fascist revolution. We don't really know. I mean, I think the whole German regions, that's going to be unstable because they are so united now. They're all nationalists. They're not their own states. Like, they're not from Bayer. They're not from Württemberg. They're not from Brandenburg. They're from Germany. They're from the specific nation, not states. So splitting them off back into states, I think, is going to throw some issues. And it's going to probably have to deal with some unrest. And overall, the region is going to be unstable for like some time.
It'll be like the Middle East of Europe.
So now, before we move on to our next topic, we're going to have a quick short ad break. This episode is sponsored by Anchor, a free podcast host.
A podcast host is a website that allows you to upload your episodes and distribute. And what makes Anchor special is that it distributes for you, ladies and gentlemen. As soon as you click submit for your podcast, Anchor automatically sends it to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many other platforms.
Best of all, you can make money with no minimum listenership.
It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place, including on your phone.
Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
Our next scenario is, what if France became communist? So in the 1920s to 1930s, especially towards the 1930s, France was having a communist fever. There was just unrest. There was workers trying to get communist revolutions. I think at one point, there almost was a revolution too. So our scenario is, what if this revolution was successful, and what if France turned to communist right before the dawn of the Second World War?
Well, obviously, that's going to lead to huge geopolitical conflicts. I think it's going to be much more of a problem between France and Germany, but we also have to look at the effect between France and the UK, because I don't think that France exactly is going to be on the best terms with the UK after the fact that they turned communist, and this would definitely improve relations with the Soviet Union. And so in this scenario, I don't know what would happen, because at first, so this is around, like, what year are we saying? This is like 1938, 1939,
30s.
that range?
I'd say 34 to 36ish, but yeah.
Okay, all right, gotcha. So in 1936, for example, I really don't know what happened actually specifically with the Rhineland, because you think Hitler would still be as aggressive as he was in that scenario?
I think so too, but a communist government generally is a more authoritarian government, which means, unlike in democracies, you suppress other people's opinions, right? So could we see a France militaristic action despite the public opinion potentially?
I don't think so. I genuinely don't think. I genuinely don't think so. It doesn't matter even if the French do it, because I guarantee you the French people won't support it, 100%.
I was gonna say before you continue your point, because the French military during this time before, like around 36, is actually larger than the German military.
Yeah, but it doesn't really matter because the French people still wouldn't support it. It's definitely true, but if you have to look at the fact that the French people did not want war at all. You could look at the British attitude towards appeasement, for example, but you could take it on steroids with the French. So I don't think they would attack into Germany. However, I do think there would maybe be some resistance at, say, the Munich conference with Czechoslovakia. There could be some resistance, but if not, I think the real resistance comes in specifically with Poland, because in this scenario, if Germany is to attack France, that pulls in the USSR. So either way, they're in a two-front war. And in the end, I think Germany collapses a little bit earlier in our timeline also, which is a little bit interesting because of the fact that the Soviets would now be trying to go on the offensive. However, due to Stalin's purges, etc., I don't think they'll be that effective for the first couple of years. So I think it's a pretty interesting take there in terms of like when the Germans will lose, but they're going to eventually lose if they decide to go to war with France or Russia either way. So they're kind of just like screwed.
That's a very interesting theory because after listening to that, if Germany's going to lose very early, it sounds like that Germany's going to lose to communist influence because you have the French to their left and the Soviets to their right. It's very interesting to see, like, in this alternate history, French being communist and like Germany going to lose early. It's going to make Europe very communist. You never know that with French being communist, we could see the Spanish Civil War to be changed. We could see other minor European countries getting influenced by big communist powers.
Yeah, Ted, you're actually 100% right. I completely forgot to mention the Spanish Civil War in that case, where I think not the Republicans, I believe that the communists in this scenario would actually win the Civil War because of the fact that the French could, number one, directly enter into their territory and help them out instead of, sending volunteers like the Axis did. But there's also the other case for scenario, which I didn't mention before, but I think it's also important to mention that socialist countries tend not to agree with each other on doctrine. We see this, for example, in the Sino-Soviet split as, for example, the Chinese Communist Party did not really like the Soviet Party, and they always kind of viewed them as a not real communist per se. And we still see that today, as a matter of fact. But getting back on stage, I think that we could probably see a similar situation towards France and Russia. And I think that might be actually the more likely of the two, where they're instead of just butting heads over which one's real socialism or which one's real communism, whatever you want to say it is.
That's 100% true. So, unlike fascism, unlike fascism, really, where fascist countries tend to have somewhat similar ideologies where they stick together, socialism can be interpreted in many ways. You have Marxism, you have Leninism, you have Stalinism, you have Maoism too. Those right there, that's a few different forms, and they all look different. However, I still think that somewhat France and the Soviet Union are going to stick together because they see Germany as a threat. I mean, Germany is a threat. They're making aggressive actions. They're making threats against communism as a whole. So I think for the safety of their own countries, because France knows they're not going to fight Germany on their own. They weren't ready for it. So I think they're going to stick with the USSR. So going to the start of the war, when Germany invades Poland, I don't think a Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact would actually happen in this scenario because the Soviet Union knows that Germany's not going to be really happy per se. Like, the only reason the Soviets did the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is because they knew they didn't have really help in the West. And I mean, they wanted to keep good relations with Germany, especially with the purge, and overall their army was just disorganized. But I don't think they would do it in this scenario because now they have a communist nation to the west, which is France. So I think when the invasion starts, I think the Soviet Union will start not invading Poland per se, but coming to the defense of Poland. Mark my words, it's in quotes, because defense for the Soviet Union generally is annexing and puppeting the state into a satellite state, but still, it's still defending the Polish from the Germans. They're just going to take it for themselves, but that's not my point. Anyway, I think the Soviets will actually get involved in the war right away at the start, and the French too will start getting involved too. I don't think the French will do any aggressive actions like invade Belgium, for example, to go up to that flat area by Germany, but I think the French will bring their navy, for example, and try harassing German subs and stuff. I mean, granted, see, Germany doesn't really need a navy for invading Poland because it's land-based, but I think the French are going to just try to help the Soviets while the Soviets try to fight off the Germans in Poland.
See, thank you for at least mentioning that Soviets wouldn't really help Poland in some account. But I have to say, though, I mostly agree with that, but I do disagree with you on the fact is I don't think they would be really allies. I think they'd be more like de facto allies, like, like the Allies were during World War II, except, United States and Britain. But I mean, like the Soviet Union were, like the Soviet Union was to America and Britain. And the reason why I say this specifically is just because of the fact that, like I said, if you want to look at it in even bigger perspective, like I mentioned before, the Sino-Soviet split, that was even during a bigger time. And this was during the Cold War, which personally I think was a more bigger threat because of actual nuclear annihilation than World War II, of course. And so I think honestly, I think the French and the Russians would still split. I don't think they would really hate each other, but I don't think they would really like each other either, because they would view each other's form of socialism, like you said, to be not real socialism.
Would you reckon that they just only help each other for the defense of each other, rather than a permanent pact, like the British and the United States, for example? But it's more like they're just only friends to help each other.
Well, they do say the enemy of your enemy is your friend, so you'll probably be more right about that. For example, since they've had a historically pretty good relationship since the Entente era, I feel like that they would probably have, since they were both socialists, I think they probably have more of a defensive pact in this scenario, almost like how France and Britain had it with Poland, but to a more of a nicer standard than say France and Poland. Oh yeah, we'll declare war on them and not attack at all.
Anyway, guys, thank you for listening to this re-recording of our first season, episode 1 episode. So, I'm planning to keep the original episode in case we decide to do any future plans with it. Point is, we're keeping it. But again, thank you for listening. If you have any comments, suggestions, or feedback, send us a tweet at Back to the Past View, or email us at back2thepastpodcast@gmail.com. Also, if you enjoyed, leave a review, because it really helps, actually. I know people say leave likes, leave reviews, leave comments, but they really do help. Anyway, have a good rest of your day.